Today, I'd like to talk about some of the other things that we can find, the things that weren't there in the building, but nonetheless are just as important in our efforts at reconstruction and in recreating what may have been lost in a different sense. So the work of the Virtual Treasury has been shaped, as we've heard, by those who worked tirelessly in the years after the fire to evaluate the scale of the loss and explore the ways and means of recovering as much as possible. Over the next few years, Retracing Archival Footsteps will continue to track and build upon these remarkable efforts. Those first efforts, as we've heard, cannot be discussed without mentioning these two men, the famous Herbert Wood on the left, and another man, D.H. Hart, here on the right. Both these men were employees of the Public Record Office at the time of the fire, and Wood, the deputy keeper, the man in charge of the day-to-day operations. In the years both before and after the blaze, their efforts at recording the contents of the building and locating replacement material was hugely important, not only to preserving and recording archival history, but also in laying the foundations upon which today the Virtual Record Treasury can be built. And through their work, we're fortunate to have available to us today two key resources. One of these is actually the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, a core partner of the Virtual Treasury, which D.H. Hart helped to create and build thanks to his knowledge of the records, and who became the first deputy keeper of that institution in 1924. The other, of course, is Herbert Wood's famous guide. This book, published in 1919, outlined the collections and material held in the repository just 3 years before the fire. Whilst it's not a true finding aid or catalogue as one would use today, as Jessica has explained, its detailed breakdown of the types of records contained in the PROI have nevertheless proved fundamental to identifying points of loss and survival. For example, the records of the Chief Secretary's office and those of the census, both of which you'll hear something more about later today. Indeed, Wood's Guide is particularly interesting work as it has not only aided in the assessment of what can be replaced, but also contained the first indications of where to look to find other sources of Irish archival material, either to replace, or to supplement the content of what was lost. Towards the rear of the guide, Wood included a section of other repositories that he knew contained Irish state papers. These were items that were not in the PROI, but would, could, or should have been, had their archival history, or the story of what happened to them from when they were made through to the present day been different. In particular, he drew attention to these repositories, both for the scale or the importance of their Irish collections, and indeed all have already contributed much to the Virtual Treasury as partners, and you can explore some of the holdings through the browse feature on the website. Wood, pictured here amongst the rubble of the PROI, retired from his post less than a year after the fire, but this did not stop him continuing his search for replacement material or corresponding with officials, both here in Ireland and in the UK, to highlight his findings and to help with reconstruction. His interests were no doubt both personal and professional, since he had worked for the office since graduating from Oxford in 1883, and as the list at the end of his guide showed, he was aware of the range of Irish historical material available beyond the walls of the PROI well before the fire. Writing in 1930, he explained the reasons for material not ending up in the PROI, noting the 3 key causes for escaping material being the carelessness of custodians, the selfishness of collectors, and the inclination of officials to regard their official documents as their own private property. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In this same article, he made clear where he thought the majority of this missing material had ended up. And as you may have guessed, by good fortune, he wrote, many have come to rest in our big libraries. Collecting history, as part of the Retracing Archival Footsteps research strand, will focus on libraries, the Irish materials they hold, and the stories behind how this material came to be there. It will identify new and significant items and investigate their archival history, the story of where and why they were created, how they survived, and who currently has them. And this will deepen our knowledge of the records themselves and, of course, of Irish history. Working with library partners in Ireland, the UK and abroad, the Virtual Treasury will enable us to connect their materials once again to other records, to the PROI, and of course to the public. The challenge and the excitement, at least for me, will be in finding these records. And to do that, I will turn primarily to the papers of historians and antiquarians. In the 16th and 17th centuries, there was a renewed interest in writing histories and accounts of countries and individuals. And in order to create these, many of the authors sought out original documents, which they either loaned, owned, or consulted. The collections of these men, and they are generally men, still survive. Those like James Ussher, the Archbishop of Armagh, a keen scholar and manuscript collector of the 17th century, whose library of over 10,000 items was donated to Trinity College in the 1660s and still remains here. Those like James Ware, another collector and friend of Ussher's, who wrote this History of Ireland. His collection of manuscripts and documents was passed through various hands of ownership and eventually dispersed, with many now being held in libraries across the UK and in Ireland, including Trinity College here and the British Library in London. These manuscripts that they used and collected were considered of value not only for their content, but also as objects of significance in themselves, and therefore worthy of collection, and this too has helped to preserve them. Pictured here is the seal of Thomas Phillips, a 19th century antiquary and owner of possibly the largest ever collection created by a single individual, which at one point had over 40,000 books and 60,000 manuscripts. Amongst them were a number of Irish pieces, unsurprisingly, and these are now dispersed far across the world. Indeed, the image of this seal comes from a Phillips manuscript I was looking at just a couple of weeks ago, in a bound collection of correspondence from the Duke of Ormond, the Irish politician of the 17th century, and it's now held at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. The manuscripts these men owned are evidence of the losses Wood had described in his article. Many of them were copied from originals that are now lost, were accidentally kept instead of being returned to their official archives, or copied from the papers of individuals who did not consider their paper public property, no matter the content. Sometimes records are kept of where these copies were taken from, and in rare instances they can actually be compared to the originals. More often, however, there are scant clues as to where the originals were or are, and so further research is needed to understand their history. But investigating the history of these items can tell us not only about where they came from, but also why they were considered to be of value over the years, how they were used, and how they've come to survive. Without them, earlier histories of Ireland could not have been written, and now we need them once again to write new histories of Ireland, its people, and the PROI. As I've mentioned, determining the archival history of a manuscript can be a challenging task. Clues can sometimes be provided in the item itself, but often additional research about the owners, sellers, or even the context of creation is required. There is much yet to discover over the next 2 years, but today I'd like to share with you the archival story of one manuscript, additional manuscript 4246, pictured here. This piece, a collection of 247 letters and other papers relating to the Irish Rebellion, is held at Cambridge University Library, and its metadata can be explored already through the Virtual Treasury, though images will be coming soon. At first glance, it looks much like any other time-worn bound volume of Irish documents, but inside the cover and written in the margins of the text are a few clues about its history. The text, ringed in orange, tells us some of the key points: that it was copied and bound at the expense of the Duke of Ormond, the same Ormond whose volume of letters were owned by Phillips of the seal we saw earlier. It was purchased by Henry St. John, Lord Bolingbroke, from the Duke of Chandos' sale, and it was donated to Cambridge by Henry Bradshaw. Using these clues alongside a little extra research can help us reconstruct much of its history. The item we have is a copy, supposedly of 247 letters, but curiously, the volume itself happens to be 247 pages long. The original, or originals, from which this copy were made, were created in Ireland by a person or persons unknown. At some point, the originals ended up in the possession of the Duke of Ormond, James Butler. The majority of Ormond's papers are now at the Bodleian Library, but the originals that correspond to those in this volume cannot be found there. In March 1680, Ormond paid for a copy to be made of the letters, and this is now our volume at Cambridge. It was probably at this point that the volume made its way to England, but to whom and for what purpose is still unclear. At some point in the 18th century, it came into the possession of James Bridges, the Duke of Chandos, a politician, patron of the arts, and collector. Due to financial debts, much of his estate was sold off after his death, including his library and this piece, in 1747. At that point, it was purchased by Henry St. John, Viscount Bolingbroke, another 18th century politician. He was not known for his collecting per se, and so the motivations for acquiring the item for him are less clear. Unfortunately, only a few years later, he died, leaving his library and possessions to his heir, his half-nephew Frederick, known as Bully, who lived an extravagant life, especially at the racetrack, and subsequently had various money troubles. So much so that his uncle's library had to be sold off to pay some of his debts. And this may account for the £3.10 sum recorded in the volume, and the point at which either Henry Bradshaw or perhaps his father purchased it. Both Henry and his father, the Bradshaws, were avid collectors of Irish material, and Bradshaw Sr.'s collection was passed on directly to his son. Bradshaw Jr. was a collector of Irish manuscripts and became the first librarian of Cambridge University Library. Across a number of years, he donated his collection to the institution, and in 1886, this volume became one of their pieces. So as we can see, this one manuscript has had quite a storied past, being used as both an item of political reference, an object for collection, and a means of covering debts. It's travelled from Ireland around England and London and finally to Cambridge, where it now appears to be the sole copy of the letters and documents it contains. And as a sole copy of now lost original material that was never in the Proy, but should have been had it not been carried off by officials, its inclusion is yet another piece towards the reconstruction of the PROI that Wood and others had hoped for all those years ago. So where to next in this journey of retracing archival footsteps? Well, over the next couple of years, this research strand will continue to find missing material to replace that lost from the Proy, as well as the pieces that should have been there but never were for the reasons Wood outlined. It will uncover and explore the archival histories of these pieces, like that for the Cambridge manuscript, and in doing so, reveal and explore the myriad stories of the items themselves, as well as the people, places, and events that engaged and shaped them and occur within them. Throughout, we'll also be deepening our collaborations with conservators, like Jessica, and libraries to make these items accessible and preserve them for years to come. In this, we'll be supported by the creation of a new libraries network, comprising major repositories here in Ireland and in the UK. These project partners will come together to share their experiences, expertise, and insights into the challenges of maintaining and uniting dispersed and disparate collections. Together, we'll deepen our knowledge of Irish history and the materials that survive, and explore new ways of connecting and making accessible Irish history through the virtual record treasury. Across the centuries, from Usher and Ware to Wood and Chart and to the historians of today, documents and archives have been a continuous presence in the quest to access, comprehend, and share the history of Ireland. Retracing archival footsteps continues in this vein, working to locate and make accessible documents of all types from Ireland's past to better preserve and engage with its history. But at the heart of it all are the documents themselves. And I found this quote that I thought summed it up rather nicely from Germaine Greer. "Archives are the pay dirt of history. Everything else is opinion, but at a certain point, you actually need documents. And perhaps nowhere is this need better seen or felt than in the quest for population and census records. And at this point, I am delighted to hand over to my colleague Brian Gurran to tell us more about his work in this area. Thank you.